What the schedule is today is we'll have a sort of a mixture of me making some comments from slides. We'll have some exercises. We'll have a machine changing on me. Okay, let's... at any time you feel like interrupting me, I hope you will feel free to ask questions. This is not a canned presentation. I'm sort of making the stuff up as I go along, so don't be shy. A little bit about my background. As was mentioned, I did my MBA at Harvard. That's where I got really excited about the case method. For those of you who are not familiar with business schools, if you do an MBA at Harvard, it consists of about 900 case discussions and then maybe 10 lecture sessions, not courses, sessions, which involve lecture. I then went on to start writing cases before I got my doctorate, while I was doing my doctorate, and then since that time, I have been at more traditionally focused business schools, first Florida Atlantic University and now the University of South Florida. Well, one of my passions has been to try to get schools that don't traditionally use the case method to be more involved with the case method. And last year I submitted a grant to the U.S. National Science Foundation, and the purpose of the grant was to integrate case studies into our undergraduate capstone course. And as part of that process, I got back to writing a lot of cases, trying to teach my colleagues how to write cases. And this presentation is sort of a byproduct of all the materials that I've been developing. So, what am I going to be talking about? Well, the first thing I'm going to do is just talk about the case method. And it's important to understand there are lots of different ways that you can use case studies. And I am not going to make any judgment about what is right and what is wrong. To a large extent, it's a matter of fit. What I am going to be talking about for the most part here is a specific approach to using cases that was pioneered largely at Harvard Business School, which involves cases written in a specific way, cases designed for discussion, facilitated with students, and for the most part not having any right answer, rather having lots and lots of possible solutions. Now, not having a right answer is not the same as saying that there are no wrong answers. There are plenty of bad solutions out there. Part of the reason to have a discussion is so that you can sort of separate out the better solutions from the solutions that don't make sense. So what I'm going to do is I will start by talking a little bit about what the case method is. I will talk about the case pedagogy, some of the different types of case studies and how they're used. In the handout that was passed out, you will actually see 3 fictitious cases dealing with the same subject matter, the story of the 3 little pigs, presented in different ways, and you'll have a chance to skim them and try and figure out what each version would be useful for. I'll then talk a little bit about facilitating case discussions in the classroom and the particularly challenging problem of measuring the learning outcomes of case studies. I mean, this is a huge challenge. Then I'll talk a little bit about the process of writing case studies, and I'll be particularly interested in case studies involving organizations. They could be businesses, or they could be non-governmental organizations, or they could be governmental organizations, or universities, or whatever. And what I provide there, also in the handouts and in the book, is a huge checklist that identifies all the things that you might want to think about while you're trying to write these case studies. Finally, and in a sense most importantly with respect to this conference, I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader impacts of case studies, because there is a certain prejudice against the case method in some research disciplines because they're used to empirical derived hypothesis testing, logically derived theories, and the case method doesn't typically fit into that, and a lot of people in these organizations simply do not believe that the case method is research. I think that is a fundamentally flawed idea, but you have to understand that the use of cases goes way beyond the physical product of publication. In my discipline, once the paper is published, it gets counted, you're done, you move on to the next project. In the case method, the case development is part of a process that helps build practice and academia closer together. And that's the key point that I want to talk about near the end. And finally, I will talk about some of the potential opportunities for funding case method projects, including a proposal that I'm hoping to make in about 8 months, and I'm looking for institutions that might be interested in participating. This would be another NSF proposal. So that's basically what I'm going to be talking about. So let's start with what the case method is. One of the great tragedies in my life is that I got an MBA from Harvard and then went into academia. It was an incredible money-losing experience. In fact, going into academia actually voids a Harvard MBA, though they don't tell you that. However, because I make so much less than my classmates, I am the official class statistician for my class. That means that I get to compile all the data on how much people are making and present it to the class. And the reason they have me present it is because when I present it, nobody feels envious of my position. My classmates from the class of '82 include Jeff Immelt, the CEO of General Electric, Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. Both of them make more in a day than I make in a year. But at any rate, one of the things I threw into our last survey, because they let me toss in questions, was what was the greatest strength of the HBS MBA program? This was for our 25th reunion. The top choice was the case method. 34% of the students said that was the most valuable thing about the program. The quality of the faculty managed to make 11%. The biggest combined group was the interaction between the classmates. And what facilitates that interaction? 900 discussion classes. You get to know your classmates very, very well. Notice nobody actually said how much money they made when they left. I don't even know that we put that on the questionnaire because that was so obvious. So, my focus here is going to be on discussion cases. Now, a discussion case is different from a lot of the case studies that we see presented, for example, in this conference, though there are also a lot of similarities. The big difference between a discussion case and the type of case study you often see published is that a discussion case focuses around an unanswered question or decision. You can always tell a case that's designed for discussion because when you start to read it, it's very clear that the purpose of analyzing this case is to help the decision maker, known as the protagonist, decide what to do. Now, when we use discussion cases, we have a lot of different objectives. One, of course, is to expose participants to realistic situations. One of the problems of disciplinary-focused programs, I, for example, teach in a master's program in MIS. You look at their curriculum, it's virtually all software and computer science-related things. I teach the last course in the program, and the first thing I point out to them is, well, it's all well and good to learn all this stuff, but what you got to realize is in the real world, about 3/4 of your problems have nothing to do with the technology. It's almost always the problems of integrating the technology into the organization. You cannot look at technology from a single discipline. You need to think about it from the perspective of the human resources involved, the structures within the organization, And in many cases, you need to think about culture, and you cannot take a one-dimensional view. Now, the second reason we use discussion cases is to encourage higher-order learning. And I'll talk a little bit about this a little bit more when we go into the specific cases. But things that you memorize, things that you comprehend, scripts you learn to apply are typically down there considered sort of lower order learning activities. You need them in order to function. They're very important. If you're not good at lower order learning activities, you're probably not going to be good at the higher order learning activities. But they don't help you very much when you encounter ambiguous situations where there's not a right answer and when there are lots and lots of factors involved. Those are kind of the higher order judgment-focused situations. And that is what discussion cases try to simulate. They also provide a forum for sharing participant experiences. One of the things that I find interesting, and this is probably the only pedagogical material that I know that fits this category, is I've got a discussion case that we developed for this project. I have now used it in 3 different programs. My undergraduate program, my Masters of MIS program, and an executive MBA program. In each case, the discussion was a fascinating discussion, but the discussion was very different. The point is, none of them complained about the fact that the case was written for the wrong audience, because each audience pulls different things out of the case and derives different experiences. So when I teach this in an executive program, I'm getting experiences discussed that actually deal with managing employees. When I teach it at the undergraduate level, they relate it perhaps to the schoolwork or their part-time job or so forth. But the point is, a well-written case can serve multiple audiences. And there are very few other curricular materials that do as well. Now, it is very, very hard to find people who genuinely dislike the case method. But I finally found someone, and I thought it was very instructive for me to go through the points that this individual makes, because what it suggests is a lot of people really don't understand what case studies are for and why you might be interested in writing case studies or using them in the classroom. Now, the first thing he makes is the Socratic Method is extraordinarily effective, and these are precise quotes from his paper. I don't like reading slides, but I will read these. The Socratic Method is extraordinarily effective for teaching many skills. However, it is ancient and inferior to the scientific method. Well, I think there's a confusion between teaching and research there possibly. But the fundamental problem is that the case method is not the Socratic method as taught at business schools. Because in the Socratic method, what you have is a series of dialogues between the instructor and individual students, whereas in the best case method discussion courses, what you have is students talking to each other. The person in the middle, the instructor, is the facilitator, and he or she is there conducting an orchestra, but the best facilitators say surprisingly little. They are not lecturing you. They are basically conducting experiences. Now, second, the case method weakens the link between research and the classroom, removing critical incentives for relevant research. Now, this is an interesting statement, because what does this say about creating cases? What does this person believe that cases are not? Research. They may be relevant, but they're not research. This past semester, I have gone out into the field with a number of other faculty members. We have developed 11 case studies of local companies. In my undergraduate class, we will have had 10 of the protagonists, the decision makers in these cases, coming in and sitting in the classroom as we discuss these cases. Now, my question is, how can we suggest that we are not bringing our research into the classroom when we go out and do this type of activity? Now, it is quite true we are not publishing papers with statistical significances. We are not publishing theory. We are publishing descriptions of situations, real-world descriptions of situations, because the cases that I deal with are authentic cases. They're not made up. The Three Little Pigs being the exception, of course. And so here he basically says, well, cases aren't research. Well, everyone's entitled to their opinion. Surrendering teaching to those with little knowledge of the vast marketing literature, this person's in marketing, cuts the quality of marketing education. So what he's saying is that I can facilitate a discussion of a marketing case while knowing nothing about marketing. Well, that will not get you very far in a classroom full of executives, I can tell you that. In fact, case facilitation requires a great deal of subject knowledge because you never know how the discussion is going to go, and you have to constantly be on the lookout for unrealistic assumptions and unrealistic statements. However, it's quite true that you might not know all the marketing theory. In fact, this was a defect of my education at Harvard, according to the rest of the world, is that I came out knowing practically nothing of the theoretical frameworks that everybody else was so enthusiastic about. My only observation on that is there is virtually no evidence that these theoretical frameworks are having any impact on anything but the academic careers of the people who publish them. I mean, I have been looking for research that actually shows that the type of research that we do in academia in my area is actually getting out into practice. I have not been able to find any evidence. Ironically, my last promotion to full professor was the result of having written a series of articles arguing that our research is of no use whatsoever. Only in academia could this happen. Fourth, the case method can teach false confidence. I still don't entirely know where he gets this. I can say from my observations of the folks entering Harvard, about 80% of us came in arrogant. About 80% of us left arrogant. However, it wasn't the same 80%. Some of us became more humble because we kept getting the cases wrong. Some of us became more arrogant. But I think it's the input here rather than the output. And what would really build false confidence is if each case had a right answer. But the problem is they don't. They have better decisions and worse decisions, but it's very, very rare to find a case that actually has a right decision. In fact, there's a name for cases that have a right decision or a correct analysis. Those are called closed cases. And when I talk about different types of cases, I'll show this book, which is a wonderful book. This is a book of engineering cases, not one of which is engineered really for discussion, because they're all focused on teaching techniques that lead to a correct answer. If you know there's a correct answer and you know how to get there, I'm not sure that discussing it is really going to help that much, discussing it with a lot of people who don't know the answer. We could lose our best students. Better students who have already acquired analytical thinking skills and confidence might seek more scientific content and technical training. Well, what does that say about the soft skills? Oh, no, nobody who's got any talent would ever try to develop soft skills. Nobody would ever worry about the people. All we got to worry about is the science, which is particularly ironic given the fact that our science isn't going out to practice. Some great research might never reach the classroom because translating it into the case method format is too challenging. I love this one because basically what it's saying is our research has become so complicated it is impossible to use it. Well, then why are we doing it? I mean, I can see doing stuff in the arts because it produces beauty, but in business research, we have never produced anything beautiful, so we darn well better be producing something useful. And what this is saying is, no, we can't produce anything useful. The case method rarely exposes students to the latest tools for making better decision makings. I just got a case approved that I am going to use a week from tomorrow. The entire process took 3 weeks. How long does it take to get an article published in a refereed journal through the typical review process? If you can get it done in 2.5 years, you are lucky. So what we're saying here, when you write discussion cases, it is amazing how quickly you can get them into the classroom. We have an experienced case writer here. Have you ever found yourself making changes a few days before the case has to go out? Always. So what I'm saying is, this person has an image of what the case method is. It really doesn't map to the reality, but after reading his entire article, I felt some sympathy for him because he obviously didn't know anything about the case method, but he was in the journal of, it was a very technologically focused marketing journal, and he didn't like cases. And he's the only person who's had the courage to come up and say that. All right, so let's take a look at the cases in the classrooms. Now, what I'd like to do is spend the next 10 minutes just having you look over the 3 Little Pigs cases. 10 minutes is not long enough to read them, and if you actually wanted to read these cases in details, you've got way too much time in your hands.
Are there any more of them, or did we run out?
Let's see. Did we run out of them? Okay, now we have an issue here. Everything we need for the presentation is in that. However, for people who signed up, because we only got 30 copies, I can also give out a copy of the book, which also has the copy of the cases. Were you one of the people who was signed up for it? Okay, well in that case I can give you your book. But I can only give the books to the people who signed up. Now my book is downloadable for free from the website in a variety of formats, PDF and so forth.
Do you need my name?
No, I'll take your word for it. It would be like Appendix A or B, or it's way at the end. Now, what I'd like you to do is look at those cases, and then after the cases, oh yeah.
I'm signed up, so I could get a copy of the book and give this.
Oh, great. Oh, of course, yes. Yeah, is there anyone else who's looking for a copy of the handouts, who needs one? Because anyone who's signed up, are you signed up? Or you're signed up. If you could lend him yours, then I'll give you the copy of the book. We had no idea that this particular seminar would be so popular. Are you signed up? Are you on the sign-up list? Because if not, we can probably get it.
Yes.
Oh, you are? Okay, great. Okay. For the rest of you who are signed up, we'll just give you your books at the end. Okay, you've got another? Normally, I would never be so trusting of faculty members, but this is such a nice conference, I'm convinced that that people... But at any rate, so just look at them, and then after the cases, you'll find a little checklist at the end that, and just for each of the cases, just make an assessment of how good you think it would be for the items in the case on the checklist. It should be right after the cases. Keep going. There are 3 cases, the A, B, and C case. After all 3, yeah, hopefully. The reason I spend time on this activity is that one of the things that I find, especially as the editor of various journals that will deal with discussion cases, is very often people don't really have an understanding of what type of case they're trying to design. And as I say, there's lots of uses for lots of different types of cases, but it's useful just at the very beginning to take a look at the kind of structure. on the pig test. Don't worry, I'm not, as I say, I'm not going to put you on the spot. I'm not going to cold call someone and demand that they open. But assuming, of course, that these cases were not fictional and that you had the remotest interest in the subject matter, as we look at the first case, let's talk about some of the ways that we might use it. And we have a suitable to very unsuitable scale. So let's start with, would this case, the A case, be a good tool to provide a deeper understanding of cause and effect or a situation and its ramifications, compared with the other cases at least? As I say, once again, it's fictitious, but how many people think that it would be, given the selection of cases, that this would be a suitable case for illustrating cause and effect and the ramifications of a situation? Just give me some hands so I know. We got some hands. We got some brave people. Good. How many people think this would be a good case for a class discussion? Okay, we have a few hands here. How about to illustrate a specific situation or the effects of a course of action? Okay, basically the hands are so low I can't get any feeling. How about as to be used to the basis of a walkthrough of a decision-making scenario? Well, we got a few hands here. To be used as an exercise for students. So basically, you guys are going to basically raise your hands on everything. All right. Well, the first thing that I would suggest you look at in trying to decide this is how the case begins, because the first paragraph tells us a lot about the case. Excluding me just trying to have fun because I'm writing ridiculous cases, what is this first paragraph telling us about? What is going to happen? What has happened? Or, if this sets up the case, what does this tell us? It tells us what happened. This is like if this were a company case, it would be, this kind, all the executives of Enron were just arrested. Now, what follows that is the story behind, what happened here, or the executives of Enron being arrested, or whatever. Now, what I would suggest, going back to the quiz here, is that we're seeing the effect and we're told the cause. So we are getting cause and effect. We've given a specific situation and the effects of a course of action. It's a pretty good fit with those two. Now, as the basis of class discussion, what would we discuss here? What is the tension that would allow us to gain value from getting a whole bunch of different perspectives? It would be possibly to discuss this case, but if we did it, we'd be doing a post-mortem. We'd be saying, well, this is what the case writer said, but is that really what happened? Because there really isn't any obvious question, except maybe what would you do differently? Now, in terms of a walkthrough of a decision-making process, I'm not sure that we want to walk through bad decisions. I think we can do enough of them without having people walk us through them. And I'm not sure what the exercise would be for the students. This case, the A case, is a story and it has a resolution. It would make a great example if you were going to present, well, assuming it were a great case, it would make a great example if you were going to present it. It would be a good illustration of what it is, and it could be the core of a research case. All I would need to do was slap a theory section in there and a couple of diagrams, and all of a sudden I've got a research case. Because typically with a research case, you're testing a model of cause and effect. Now, let's go on to the B case. And we'll bring up pig test again.
I have a question.
Sure.
Because that was a story that was told and resolved in the first paragraph, you're saying that it's not suitable for items 2, 4, and 5 in this rubric.
Well, it's less suitable. A good facilitator can turn bad cases into interesting discussions. But I can tell you it is much, much harder to discuss a case that has been resolved. If it's resolved in a positive way, then 90% of the class is going to say, oh, well, the decision makers could do no wrong. They got this exactly right. If it's resolved in a negative way, they're going to say, well, look at all the ways these people screwed up. But you're really doing a post-mortem. And the problem with really complex situations is that even experts can't necessarily predict the outcome of a given situation. When asked about whether or not the Soviet Union was going to break up, a series of Russian experts in the US in 1988 split about 50-50 as to whether it was going to break up. Basically, you could have done as well by flipping a coin. What was really interesting is they went back to these folks 5 years later and asked them about their analyses, and all of them claimed that they were right. The ones who did not predict the breakup said, yes, but there is no way we could have known that X, Y, Z was going to happen and affect this. Complex situations are very, very tough for experts to predict, and this is one of the reasons why I like to do authentic cases, because at least in that case I'm describing a situation that's really taking place. I am not throwing my own thoughts in about what should happen or what won't happen as a consequence of that. So now let's take a look at the Three Little Pigs case, the B case. How good is this case? How many of you think it's really suitable for explaining cause and effect? Don't see a lot of hands there. Why is that? How does the B case begin? What's the core of the introduction of the B case? Well, I guess I can actually, we don't have to guess, I can show. It is a decision. Has the decision been made? No. Now, we have something we can discuss. The question that we need to resolve is, what decision should we make? And in this case, there is a lot of background material that you can use in support of or against the particular decision. And we also have some options that are set up. Maybe not all the possible options, but we have some choices. This type of case, because there is a decision associated with it, tends to be a pretty good case for discussion. On the other hand, it's lousy for cause and effect. And one of the interesting things about the cases that I've been developing this particular semester is that the decisions were really being made as I presented these cases, which means that I have no idea whether they're going to make good decisions or bad decisions. All we can do in the analysis is say what we think they should do. And even if they do something different, that might not be as good as the recommendation we came up with. On the other hand, it's possible for every good possible recommendation we might come up with, there are literally thousands of bad combinations, because these are combinations, just common sense will tell you, are doomed to fail. And that is one of the key things about discussion cases, is they generally do not have a right answer They generally have a number of possible choices that you can explore based upon what is presented in the case. And even though the cases that I write are typically much longer than the Three Little Pigs, most of the cases our group has written are at least 10 single-space pages with another 10 pages of exhibits. So they take a student 2 or 3 hours to prepare these cases. But even that doesn't give you all the information, so there's still room for tacit assumptions and disagreements based upon what the student's own understanding of things like the cultures and the technologies and so forth are. All right, now, how about as the basis of a walkthrough of a decision-making process? Well, we're really at the decision point right now. We're not necessarily going to do and since we don't know if there's a right answer, it's hard to do a walkthrough. Now, we can do this as an exercise for the students. I mean, we could give it as an exercise for the students, but when you do it as an exercise for the students, you don't get the benefit of the diversity of opinion you get in a classroom full of students actually discussing it. All right, so we'll go on to the last case. And here we move a little bit earlier into the Three Little Pigs scenario, where one of the pigs is actually, where the pigs are trying to design their houses, and Charlotte in particular, the sensible pig, I don't know what the names of these pigs are, but is trying to make a decision based upon all the factors. Now, if we take a look at this, what I would, let me just pull back the form. Because there's a decision to be made, I would say the cause and effect is not so strong. The problem with this case is, well, what would be the problem if you were trying to run a discussion on this case? What does this case, the C case, have that all the other cases don't have? Lots and lots of sort of random information. Things like diagrams and tables and stuff. Also, if you look at this particular case, there is a certain sense from an operations research standpoint that there could in fact be a right answer to this case. In fact, I designed it so that there was, you could actually find an optimal combination that maximizes the different criteria specified in the case. While you could use this as a discussion case, I would personally be very uncomfortable with it. Extremely complicated cases with lots of numbers and lots of assumptions and so forth are harder to discuss because it's very, very hard to get people on the same page. Now, when I was at HBS, they taught a couple of the subjects like accounting using the case method early in our program. And one of the things that always disconcerted me was when a student, was asked to, explain or write out, the accounting balance sheet or income statement, or maybe do some elementary bookkeeping on the board, they often got it wrong because they didn't understand the concept, and everyone in the class is taking notes. Because in many of these subjects, there really isn't a lot of judgment involved. There's a procedure you have to learn. Well, I would say discussing a procedure, if there is a procedure, might not be the best way to present it, because especially if you're discussing it with students who don't know the procedures, you're likely to get a lot of wrong procedures thrown out by the class, and chances are some of them are going to remember the wrong procedures and not the right procedures, particularly if they're not that interested in the subject. On the other hand, you could do this as a walkthrough. The professor could basically take the class through step by step through the process of analysis, maybe asking the students each time along the way, okay, what should my next step be? But then the professor can control whether or not a bad step gets put on the board. So I would suggest that in this case it could be used as a walkthrough, and it could also be used as an exercise for students. There are lots of cases in this book which primarily consists of made-up cases, essentially extended word problems, that faculty members are supposed to walk the students through the solution because it makes it more concrete. And this is a great use of case studies. It's just not what we would call the case method because it's less of a discussion than a faculty member walking you through a series of steps. Cardinal rule of case writing is understand what type of case you're trying to write before you start writing the case, because otherwise you're going to have to do a huge amount of rewriting in order to get it right. Again, I'm uncomfortable using terms right and wrong, but to get it really useful. Now, one of my areas of regular research overlaps strongly with the case method, and it essentially involves the notion of task complexity. There has never been a construct in the organizational and psychological literature that has been as mucked up as task complexity. And I've written a number of papers on this where I survey, 200 or 300 definitions that have been proposed in the literature, and the definitions are entirely inconsistent with each other, even though there's still a certain similarity to the flavor. Well, the best I can do is to classify these definitions into three general categories, and I think this is a fairly useful classification. The first category involves unfamiliarity of the task. If you don't know how to do a task, it's an unfamiliar task, and that is, a lot of people perceive that as a source of complexity because unfamiliar tasks seem difficult, because essentially you don't have any canned solutions for them. So when we experience difficulty, it's often a result of unfamiliarity. Now, a second category of complexity is finding a path from where we are to where we want to go. And I have a name for the dimension there, which is sort of path entropy, but for the time being, I will use the term complicated to deal with that. Case 3, the Three Little Pigs C case, was a complicated case. You may know where you want to go. You may know you want to reach an optimal solution, but there are lots and lots of variables and relationships and so on that you have to work on in order to reach that solution. Another good example of complicated is comparing say, moving from point A to point B in Manhattan versus moving from point A to point B in Boston. Now, in Manhattan, all the streets are laid out in a grid, which means there are lots of different ways to go from point A to point B. Okay, you go 7 blocks south and 3 blocks east. You can do almost any combination as long as you do the same ratio and you'll end up in the same point because it's a grid. There are lots of different paths. On the other hand, in Boston, the streets are laid out where the old cow paths used to be. Many of them are one way. Many of them are under construction. There are some people in Boston who think it is impossible to get from some point A's to some point B's. And any time you ever ask anyone for directions in Boston, they will not be able to tell you them. They respond in two ways: I don't know, or they give you a set of directions that are totally wrong just to get rid of you. And this is, try asking for directions in Boston and you'll see what I mean. They give you this deer in the headlights look and say, oh, I don't know. See, because even if they do know, it will take a book to explain the directions because the streets aren't lined up. They're curved, they're one way, they're rotaries. That is complicated. So even where you know where you want to go, it can be very difficult to get there. Of these three dimensions, by the way, complicated is the one that I find least attractive for the case method because it's so easy to screw up. And when you screw up in a discussion, you're basically, 80 people or however many people you've got in the discussion are getting the wrong impression. Now, the third dimension is the one that a lot of folks miss, and this is actually very close to the notion of complexity as it is used in evolutionary biology. And this involves actually figuring out what your goal is. What is the end state going to be? And the key characteristic here is decomposability. And I had some wonderful lead-ins today with Mr. Waters' presentations because what he is talking about are classic examples of failures of decomposability. When you have a decomposable goal, you can break it into a series of sub-goals, and you optimize each sub-goal, and the final goal is met. Think about the questions, think about your score on an SAT test. You get a certain amount of points for every question you get right. A certain number of points are deducted from every question you get wrong. It doesn't matter what you did on the other questions. All that matters is adding up the points. So your question scores add up decomposability, and your goal is to get the highest possible score. In a world that is rugged, on the other hand, the effect of one variable cannot be determined until you know what all the other variables are. This is, in psychology, where they refer to this as the interaction effect. So if there's a particular fitness to our decision, what will happen is in a decomposable world, you can identify the effect of each variable, of each choice that you make. In a maximally rugged landscape, each choice that you make is affected by all the other variables. So an incremental change of a variable can have a big effect under certain circumstances and no effect under other circumstances. They run into this problem in epidemiological studies in medicine all the time because when you look at individual effects, you come out with a conclusion, but if you look at subsets of the data, you come out with different conclusions. This is why it's so hard to get straightforward statements, such as in today's earlier example, for those of you who attended the earlier presentation, is selenium, is selenium good for you? Does selenium reduce your risk of cancer? Well, it does under some circumstances, doesn't under other circumstances, and sometimes it makes it worse. Now, my analogy for a rugged landscape is a cookbook. If we think about a cookbook, well, first off, if I were just to throw ingredients together at random and cook them at any process that just happened to be at hand, what is the likelihood that I would come out with a really good end product? Just if I throw stuff together at random, don't care, just, the first 10 ingredients I see in the kitchen, throw them into a frying pan because what's the likelihood that I'm going to come up with a good result? Hopefully, 0. Which means there are bad solutions to cooking. But if you look at a cookbook, each entry in the cookbook is called a recipe. And each recipe represents a local peak. Because if you were writing a cookbook, would you say that the recipe should have a cup of sugar when you know that a cup and a half will actually make it taste better? Now, there's obviously some subjectivity there, but each chef designing a cookbook has essentially tried different combinations to come up with a combination where no small change leads to a better outcome. That's what's called fitness. But it becomes much harder if I'm comparing, say, an angel food cake to a leg of lamb. Because the recipe for the leg of lamb is at a peak, the recipe for the angel food cake is at a peak, but knowing a lot about the angel food cake doesn't tell me that much about the leg of lamb. And in particular, if the world were decomposable, what would happen is I would be able to make statements that adding garlic to a recipe is always good. Well, I like garlic as much as the next man, but I'm not sure that I would necessarily want garlic in my angel food cake. Now, there is a restaurant in San Francisco called the Stinking Rose that adds garlic to every one of its recipes. And some of those recipes are really outstanding, but when you get to the dessert tray, I have to say, I was not that impressed by the garlic. It was a great gimmick, but I don't think I'd necessarily go out and seek garlic in my desserts. Now, the greater the complexity, which is to say the less the decomposability, the greater the number of peaks that you have. And that can be shown mathematically. The more interactions you have, the more local peaks that you're going to have. And we also have uncertainty. We don't really know how good each peak is often before we explore it. This is a domain that case studies are very good for because, as I say, there are lots of really bad ideas and there are a few good ideas, but the good ideas may be quite far apart in terms of what we do. In some cases, we may decide tuning the strategy is the best idea. In other cases, we may decide we need a totally different strategy. Each one has pros and cons, and even the managers involved, some managers may be good with a particular approach, and some managers may not be good. So let's get back to the question of teaching cases. The discussion case tends to focus on unmade decisions. You can have a long discussion case, which is the kind of cases that I tend to focus on, where I provide sort of the full context. When I'm dealing with undergraduates, if I do a case on security, one of the things that I have to do is I have to provide them some background, say, on the subject of encryption, because I can't count on them having remembered that from their introductory course. Now, if I were dealing with executives, I probably wouldn't need to put that background in. You can also have short cases provide a decision without that much context. For example, if I were writing a case study on a student trying to decide what career to take after completing the MIS major at our school, I wouldn't have to put a lot of information in about the MIS major. I wouldn't have to put a lot of information in about our school, as long as I'm using the case for that audience. Now, if I'm publishing the case and I expect it to be used for a wide audience, then I do need to put that information in, because the wide audience won't necessarily know that background, which is why you can't write every case short. Now, example cases tell stories about cause and effect, and that's also what research cases do. One of the great things about writing discussion cases is you can write a discussion case, detail all the factors in the situation, then come back 6 months later and write a research case, because now all of a sudden you see the outcome of the decision, and then you can figure out what theories apply and get it published in a research journal. I think this is very important because if it means that you have an obligation to write discussion cases carefully and as accurately as possible, because they can become the source for research. In fact, they are research. They're simply research that describes an observation rather than an outcome. Walkthrough cases provide rich problem-solving context. There are a lot of cases in here that I would call walkthrough cases, and a lot of cases here I would call exercise cases, because it's very different giving someone an equation to solve and giving them a context about which an equation, without the equation, and getting them to figure out which equation applies. It turns out even very bright students have a lot of problems with that. So I do not want to sound as if I am criticizing these types of cases. It's just I probably would not discuss them in a large classroom with people, because it would be a really tough discussion. So going back to those domains, complicated, figuring out how to get there; ruggedness, figuring out where to go; and unfamiliarity. What I would argue is if it's not very complicated and it's not very rugged, and we're pretty close to what students already know, might as well lecture. Lecture is a good way of getting information out, and if you really know the problems, it's very fast. One of the best courses I ever had was a course I took at MIT on introductory computer programming. Now, by that point, I'd been programming professionally for 4 years, but I'd only had one course, and that was 15 years before, and I'd gotten a C in it. I was entirely self-taught, so there were lots of things I didn't know. I went into this lecture course, and every time he talked about an advanced topic that was going over every other student's head, I was saying, oh yeah, I've run into that problem, that's how I solve it. I mean, I cannot believe how much information. I have literally taught 6 courses based on the information that I got in that one course because I understood everything and I was motivated to understand everything. It wasn't that unfamiliar for me, and because I already had the mental structures in place, it wasn't that complicated, and there was a right answer. I mean, it was great. As it gets more complicated, you can start to do lectures and then maybe supplement them with exercise cases to give people the experience. One of the problems with the human mind is we can only handle a certain number of concepts at once. If we want to be able to handle more concepts, what we need to do is we need to practice things so that, because once you practice doing something, you can get it down so it takes no room in your mind at all, and that gives you enough room to do other things. That's why it is impossible for some young people to learn certain concepts, because even though they're simple to us, they involve so many different concepts at once, none of which are familiar, their mind simply doesn't have room for them, because you can't pay attention to all those things at once. So the key thing here is if the main issue is just complication, what I would argue is lectures and exercises are probably the best way to go. When I teach a programming course, I do not discuss my programs because, a loop is a loop, and it's going to behave, if I give them a block of code and ask them to explain it, it's only going to behave in one way. So as a consequence, if they're trying to learn about blocks of code, this makes sense. Now, as you move into the domain of high ruggedness, in a familiar area, then you can do the short discussion cases because you don't need to provide all the background, you just provide the specific problem. What do I want my goal to be? If it's complicated and rugged, then you have to do the discussion cases, but these ones are bears to facilitate. Now, as we move up in the unfamiliarity domain, if it's not that rugged, and it's not that complicated, this is a great place for an example. This is where in my class, I'll spend 2 minutes talking about what happened at a particular company. Because I'm not looking for discussion of it. I am using the story, which is one of the most effective tools that the mind has for remembering things. You look at any book on memory, and what they'll tell you is we are hardwired for stories. Which is not surprising because until we got written language, stories were the principal way of remembering things. And when a story wasn't enough, we would make it rhyme and turn it into an epic poem, and then we could remember a 3-hour poem. Not all at once, but with practice you can do it. But the point is, if there's not much rugged, then you have problems with an example and walk-through cases. Again, without ruggedness, what we're saying here is there's a right goal, there's a right answer, and therefore you might as well, help people find the right answer. Don't take them down all sorts of false paths, except every once in a while, because sometimes going down a false path and then discovering it was false is an important learning experience. Up here, in the domain of high ruggedness and a lot of unfamiliarity, is where the discussion case, I think, is the most valuable. Particularly this quadrant here, where it isn't necessarily so complicated, but on the other hand, there's a lot of context that has to be provided. And that's what I'm saying. What makes something unfamiliar is the fact that you don't understand the context, and what makes it rugged is there are lots of possible solutions that a sensible manager can take. When I go into a company and try to find a case topic, the first thing I do is ask, what decisions are you making right now that you haven't actually made? Because I can tell you most, and I'll talk about this when I walk through the case writing process, most managers would infinitely rather tell you about their great successes than about the decisions that are currently being made. But the decisions currently being made are the core of what makes the case method. I notice I'm going a little bit slower than I expected, so I'll just give a little bit of theory here. If you take a look here, Bloom's taxonomy, Newell and Simon's intelligence design choice. If you look at the case method, if you look at using cases, it basically tends to provide stuff up here, some knowledge that you have to understand, and it's particularly focused down here at evaluation. Cases are really good for helping you develop judgment and shared knowledge and comprehension. In the case of the Newell and Simon framework, intelligence and choice are particularly good. Now, it is possible to write cases designed